All right, welcome back, Fantasy Sports. Today, we have a supersized edition of the show. Craig Mish, Davis Maddock, Joe Pisapia with you for the next 2 hours, getting you ready for the upcoming Super Bowl. I want to thank Matt Stryker, of course, for hanging out with us for a couple hours. Tommy Reynolds also producing the program today. For those of you who are watching, we are SportsGrid. This is Fantasy Sports Today. Every Saturday morning and every Sunday morning. And with the football season ending, folks, it doesn't stop here because, of course, fantasy baseball season is right around the corner. Daily fantasy basketball, hockey as well. But gentlemen, here we go. We've got the Super Bowl coming up, the last day of the football season. And Joe, always a fun day to kind of unpack every single play. Everyone's watching the minutia of it, what went right, what went wrong. And then as we get older, we can't even remember who played in the Super Bowl like 5 years ago. It's really incredible. Like you think about all of this hype leading up to the game, and we're going to have a hard time recalling exact plays from the Super Bowl. It's just the way we are.
You couldn't even recall your favorite first Super Bowl that you watched today. So obviously,
True.
yes, you got to take that ginkgo biloba, or whatever the heck it's called. You got to start taking some of those medicines. Now they're not FTC approved or whatever it is, or FDA approved, whatever it is.
Thanks for the
But
advice.
whatever it is.
Well done.
There you go. Start with the supplements. But look, when you're looking at this game today, another fun fact that I threw out on a lot of my shows earlier this week is how the 49ers fared against the AFC. Now, the NFC West, I think we could all agree, was a little lackluster this year. The Rams did kind of catch up towards the end there, certainly made it interesting. But fun fact here, let's go back and take a look at the 49ers and how they performed against some of the AFC teams this year in 2023, because it's kind of a checkered past when you see it. We'll throw preseason out because it does not matter. Now, the San Francisco 49ers came up short, lost on the road against the Cleveland Browns 19-17. They did beat the tar out of the Jacksonville Jaguars, but we all know the Jaguars had a lot of issues. They beat up on them 34-3. Okay, that's fine. Keep going on here. Against the Ravens, 33-19. They lost. We talked about that game earlier. Against the Bengals, 31-17. They lost back in October. They haven't really played well against AFC teams all year. And the NFC, I think we can all agree, was a lot weaker. We keep lauding the 49ers and how well they did against the Dallas Cowboys, but we kind of see, Dallas Cowboys got shellacked at home by the Green Bay Packers, who then almost beat the 49ers. Let me remind everybody again, probably should have beaten them. Davis, when you start looking at the 49ers record against the other conference, to me, it's kind of a red flag about how good this team is. It's one thing to be great against lesser competition. It's another thing to be great against teams that maybe stand out a little bit more. And I know a lot of us thought maybe the NFC was the better conference this year going into it, but as the Eagles fell apart, the Cowboys fell apart in the playoffs yet again, were inconsistent on the road. And at different times, you look at some different teams that popped and then faded back into the pack. What do you think about the 49ers' lack of AFC productivity when those teams came in to face them?
I mean, look, you can only beat who you have to play in front of you, and it's not the 49ers' fault that they play in the junior varsity conference, right? Which they definitely do. Craig, on Fantasy Sports Today on Saturdays, all year long, we were saying, okay, you look at the NFC, you got Jalen Hurts, and you got Dak, and you kind of just have like a bunch of guys. Now, obviously, Purdy had this incredible season, best yards per attempt season any quarterback has ever had. I mean, we all kind of know the deal with the Shanahan offense. I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo led the NFL in EPA not once, but twice as a member of the San Francisco 49ers. I think the two warning flag games to me for the San Francisco 49ers, if you were looking to have a reason to bet on the Kansas City Chiefs, or looking for a reason to bet on this game, and it didn't come down to, well, the Chiefs have Mahomes. Like, if you were looking for another reason, it would be that Ravens game on Christmas Eve where Brock Purdy threw 4 interceptions, looked like he was playing, looked like he was back in his junior year at Iowa State playing against Texas, just completely clueless, having no idea what was going on out there. And it was also, I feel like this game really, because it was so long ago, no one really remembers it. But it was that game against the Cincinnati Bengals where Purdy went 22 of 31, 2 interceptions, got sacked twice. The 49ers couldn't get anything going on the ground. And the reason why I highlight that Bengals game is the Bengals defense was not good. This was not a game like the Browns game. I could explain away that Browns game, right? Bad weather, that crazy Browns defense. Browns defense was the best in the NFL. They just, no one could breathe against that Browns defense. The Bengals had a terrible defense. They just were not a good team. Now, I have heard this explained away. This is a little bit of conspiracy corner here on Fantasy Sports Today, that Purdy suffered a concussion in that Browns game. Remember, he was in the concussion protocol between the Browns and the Vikings game. And so the explanatory variable there would be, Purdy passed the concussion protocol, but was still dealing with symptoms. And by the time they got through their bye week 2, that Jaguars game, he had, his brain, I guess, had, gotten to a more natural state or whatever. I don't really know if I buy that. I think that the central tenet here is that the 49ers are probably the best team I've ever seen when things are on script. Like when Kyle Shanahan is not playing jazz, when Kyle Shanahan is doing math on the sidelines and he's like, all right, I'm going to call this play here, and I see this many men in the box, so we're calling this play here, we're doing this. No team is better than that. But when they start to bleed their own blood a little bit, when Purdy throws an interception in the first quarter and the other team starts to march down the field and, you got Kittle yelling on the sideline, like that's when I feel just a little bit less confident that as a team, they're just going to be able to stay calm.
Yeah. No, look, the 49ers, sometimes they're their own enemy. Other times in Super Bowls, Joe, what we see is the referees become their own enemy. But, Joe, it's really interesting if you've watched the NFL playoffs thus far. It does seem like there's been more of an emphasis on letting the players play. I don't know if you think that that's a coincidence. And, understandably, the Baltimore Ravens were called for a lot of penalties, but those were on national TV. These guys hitting these other the Chiefs in the head, like it was obvious to see. But beyond that, that's one takeaway I've had from these playoffs, and I wonder if that will continue in the Super Bowl. We're just not seeing a lot of flags.
I think it's a good observation, and I agree with it, and I think it will continue, and I think it is good for the game. I think the one thing that the NFL has always taken hits on, too, is when these games get controlled by the referees too much. I think when things are obvious, obviously you have to call them, and you have to enforce the rules of the game. But when things are close and you see guys pushing on both sides, you let it play out. And I think it's better for the continuity of the game. It's better for the flow of the game. It's also better for the players, too, because then they know they can get a little bit more physical and they can do a little bit more. And I think that also portends to a more exciting football game that you're going to get today. And of course, the one thing that really bothered me all week too is all the stuff that you're hearing about. Oh, it's rigged. The NFL is rigged. What a stupid thing of nonsense. Like all these stupid social media posts and these stupid things everywhere. These reels of people talking about it's rigged. Come on.
I hope it's rigged. I hope it's rigged.
I know Davis hopes it's rigged. That I know for sure.
I hope they're rigging it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just so stupid. That whole narrative is ridiculous. And look, there's going to be, I'm sure at a certain point, Craig, there's going to be a call that goes against a team that people are going to either question or whatever it might be. You have one job. And it doesn't matter if it's the NFL. It doesn't matter if it's the flag football youth that I coach. I always tell them the same thing. Play better than the referees call the game. Don't leave it into referees' hands. Take the game in your own hands. I think that's good advice for both teams today, Craig.
Yeah. I mean, the games are not rigged, but if you've watched the playoff games as opposed to the regular season games and you're watching less flags, I mean, to me, there's no question that there's a conversation that's been had. I mean, we want these games to be not controlled by the refs. We'll be right back on Fantasy Sports Today.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks throwing one touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with one touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs.
but I bet on him. This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as the coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Everybody looks to rankings in fantasy football and kind of goes off them, to be honest. Joe, of course, does his over at Fantasy Pros. Davis does his here for SportsGrid. And, of course, they both are talking fantasy football all season long. And it's like when I'm pivoting over to baseball, I mean, Joe's doing baseball too, let's be honest. So is Davis. But it's like fantasy football is the absolute king of, let's be honest, fantasy sports year round. And so, gentlemen, I know that you've had a chance to take an early look at some of the rankings. Davis, I'll start with you here. Quarterbacks in fantasy are running the show now. Joe mentioned super flex leagues, how wildly popular they have become. I think Joe advocating all these years for 2 quarterback leagues finally worked. It seems like everybody's using it. But Davis, who is the top quarterback you think going into the upcoming season?
I think it's got to be right now Josh Allen. Now, I'm prepared to change my mind about that heading into this upcoming season. I think a couple things would happen. One, if Stephon Diggs is not a member of the Buffalo Bills and they don't really do much of anything to replace him, because Diggs makes a lot of money, Craig. He makes a lot of money to have gotten outgained and outproduced by Khalil Shakir over the final 8 games of the Buffalo Bills season on about 50 more targets than Khalil Shakir. And you remove him from the offense, you're like, all right, we got Kincaid, we got Knox, we got Shakir, Gabe Davis is going to be off, greener pasture. I think Gabe Davis actually might end up being a Kansas City Chief. We can talk more about that later when we get to some free agency stuff. And Jalen Hurts, he ended the season in such a, what's the opposite of memorable? And very just, he's playing with the hurt knee and they're yelling at each other on the sidelines, and Devonta Smith is injured and A.J. Brown is injured and Dallas Goedert breaks his wrist. And it just it was such a mess that I feel like people forget some very simple math, just literally the most simple math that you could imagine, which is that touchdowns are what we want in fantasy football. You get the most points for a touchdown. And when the Philadelphia Eagles are inside the 5-yard line, you can bet your bottom dollar that Jalen Hurts is going to get 2 chances to score the easiest touchdown that anyone in football gets. Now, will it be a little bit different if Jason Kelce does end up retiring, as he suggested after their playoff loss to the Buccaneers? It definitely will be different. But Jalen Hurts just walks into every fantasy football season with 15 touchdowns. He just gets those, right? Almost every game, he's going to get you 6 points from a rushing touchdown. So it's definitely one of those 2 guys. I'm saying Josh Allen right now, reserving the right to change my mind, though.
I wasn't aware, Davis, that Stephon Diggs was still with the Buffalo Bills last year in the second half of the season because I didn't see him. I didn't see him anywhere, my friend. Yeah, I'm with Davis here. If you look at the expert consensus rankings over at Fantasy Pros, Josh Allen's at number 1, Hurts is at 2. My concern with some of those rushing touchdowns maybe going away for Hurts if Jason Kelsey doesn't come back. He is the most important thing in that tush push in the brotherly shove. So if that comes out of the offense or isn't quite as good as it's been in years past because Kelsey's not there, I think it's something to think about. You have Lamar at 3, Mahomes at 4. I think that's pretty easy to parse out there. Prescott at 5. CJ Stroud, I love CJ Stroud. Nobody was a bigger fan going into this draft season last year of CJ Stroud than me. He was my number 1 quarterback on the board. He was a guy that I bet for rookie of the year. I was very much in on him, but I still think 6 is also very high. Nico Collins was great last year, but 7, Richardson. That's the one I want to talk about. Anthony Richardson, it might not always look pretty next year, but if he stays healthy, I think Davis will probably agree. He might be the best return on investment on this quarterback board in a single quarterback league because he has a chance to finish as a top 3 and maybe even number 1 overall in terms of fantasy points. He brings the rushing equity. He's got a huge cannon for an arm. If they bring back Pittman and franchise him, that's a huge move there. So Richardson's the guy that I'm circling right now. I do think as time goes on, you might see him go as early as the 5th guy off this board when we get into August as people like Davis and myself start to hype train everything. But Fields, Burrow, Herbert, Purdy sneaks in there at 11, Kyler Murray at 12. That feels like about the consensus 12 to me. We can argue about the order, but to me, that guy, Craig, is Richardson that I am circling with a big red pen that could really be a guy that just completely transforms your fantasy team. And if you're doing dynasty startups, especially those superflex leagues, you have to consider taking extremely early because of what he potentially brings. I know CJ Stroud's already done it, but again, we're talking about the rushing equity, the rushing touchdowns, the other pieces of the game that, from a fantasy perspective, a guy that could be like Lamar, but Lamar plus from a passing standpoint.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time watching Richardson, the University of Florida. One of my biggest takes was, don't even come close to this guy. You're what I was totally wrong in fantasy. He was awesome in the first. I was shocked at how well he played right out of the gate. So certainly I'm not going to double down on that take going into year 2. Okay, so I think a lot of people, guys, may be surprised how much Jordan Love has moved up. I mean, he is right now on the fringe of the QB1 ranked. We have him here at 13 going into next season. And maybe as surprising, Joe, is Tua Tagovailoa. The love is off him now. I mean, after the season the Dolphins had, especially the way that they cratered at the end of the year, he's no longer a top 12 guy. We have him here at 14. Trevor Lawrence, you could say the same. And I think that in fantasy drafts, Joe, once you get to this range, the, let's say 14 through about 21, 22, I don't see a ton of variance. It almost feels like everyone's going to be comfortable with their first QB1 and then, sort of predicting who could be jumping into the Jordan Love range from out of it is going to be the most difficult part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jordan Love's second half, I think, was fantastic. Limiting the turnovers, you saw the touchdown to interception rate really spark, and he didn't even have a healthy Christian Watson most of the season. So you add him back into the mix. You have a lot of weapons here. We'll see what they do at the running back position. But Love is a guy to me that is a QB1, not a QB2. So I think this expert consensus ranking is just flat out wrong right now. I think he earned that mark. And I think he's going to continue to progress. And to your point, Tua took a step back in the second half there. So some question marks there, but a lot of questions in QB2, which, again, Davis, you're talking about guys, we're waiting for Trevor Lawrence to take that step forward. He didn't do it this year. We're, waiting to see what the hell Cleveland does with Deshaun Watson here, because that's a huge question mark. Where is Kirk Cousins going to be? Can Aaron Rodgers stay healthy enough through the entire season? Geno, Baker Mayfield, a lot of questions in this QB2 group. I keep telling everybody, hit quarterback early and often when it comes to Superflex, because the questions are abound when you get to this QB2 group.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan Love, I just went through and redid my dynasty rankings. Obviously, what better time to do it? Craig's looking at pitchers and catchers. He's trying to report on MLB free agency, and I'm sitting here trying to dial down my dynasty rankings. And in Superflex, I moved Jordan Love up to be a first rounder. I actually think there's like a pretty good argument to be made that we haven't even come close to seeing the best of Jordan Love. He had a total patchwork offensive line in 2023. And the youngest wide receiver group in the NFL, his oldest wide receiver, the veteran of the room, was Christian Watson, who is 23 years old, didn't play, which basically only played in about half the games for the Packers. They were the youngest team in the NFL, I think that there's and he barely ran, and he ran a lot at Utah State. He only had 4 rushing touchdowns. He was like a legit running quarterback at Utah State. So I think we could see more of that this upcoming season. I think that you really can't go wrong with the Goff, Stafford, Cousins range of those guys. That would be very comfortable quarterback 2 names. But once you get past that and you get into Watson, Rodgers, Geno, just kind of that real dregs, I think you're better off zooming out even further than that and just being like, I'm taking JJ McCarthy. I'm taking Drake May. Drake May right now, I know, Craig, you're not going to believe this. I'm already doing fantasy drafts for 2024, in anticipation. And Drake May, you can get for free. You could just get him for free. And I would not be surprised to see Drake May, run for 600 yards and 4 touchdowns as a rookie. So I did just have to drop that nugget for Craig. Before the Super Bowl, we already have our eyes on 2024.
Yeah. Guys, real quick, Deshaun Watson, is it over for him this early on? Real quick, 30 seconds.
Too much money. Too much money.
Yeah, I was going to say, not because of the contract. Yeah, the contract, I think, prohibits them moving on, which is crazy. But how could you not keep Flacco or bring somebody else in to compete to make sure you have something to back you up? Because it's too dangerous not to at this point.
All right, we got to take a time out here on FST. We'll be back with more of our Super Bowl edition of the show next.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks throwing 1 touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with 1 touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on them.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's 1 game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the 4th quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the 2 biggest games of the 2 Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the 4th quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl Sunday here on Fantasy Sports Today. Thanks for tuning in. Craig Mish, Davis Maddock. My gosh, we have covered a lot in the first couple hours of the show. We still have 2 hours to go here covering the Super Bowl. It's like, look, Super Bowl coverage was meant to be 12, 15, 17, 25 hours in advance. Anywhere you turn, you're watching. And we're doing the same thing here on the show, except we're mixing in some other conversations, and we're taking a look at some early rankings for the upcoming 2024 NFL season, which, let's be honest, draft season's only a few months away for Davis, for Joe. I mean, they've got this stuff started already. All right, gentlemen, let's pivot over now to the tight end position. Davis, on the shows, Joe, that we have hosted, I have made the claim that I think that we're headed toward a more positive era of the tight ends in fantasy football. That's not to say we're going to have a Kelsey or a Gates or a Witten or like this incredible tight end to take number one in the first round. I think that coming into the 2024 season, Davis, that the days of, let's say you don't take a tight end high and you end up taking your starter in the 5th, 6th round and you're hoping for 3 catches and 30 yards, I think where the floor is going to be raised a little bit this year. I like some of the younger players that I'm seeing.
I mean, that I actually agree with you. I think that a lot of the times fantasy analysts come into the season and say, "Oh, tight end's deep, man. Tight end is deep," and it's never deep. And maybe we will be, Charlie Brown with the football again. We'll be like, "What? You can get Kyle Pitts in the 8th round? You can get Dallas Goedert? You can get Trey McBride?" And then it turns out it's like, well, Kyle Pitts had 600 yards, and Jake Ferguson ended up in a timeshare with Luke Schoonmaker, and T.J. Hawkinson didn't come back until week 10 because his knee is a mess, and Dalton Kincaid averaged 4.3 yards per reception. He's basically Cole Beasley, but at tight end. I think the biggest difference in tight end this year to the years past, I'm just looking through these names, and like, I don't think there's really anyone who's capable of doing a 2022 Kelsey season where they score 300 PPR points and they beat everyone else by like 4 points per game. If there was anyone on this list, it would for sure be Mark Andrews to me. We did see the Ravens get more pass heavy. It was the most pass attempts of Lamar Jackson's career. He wins MVP. And Andrews was maybe on pace to have that season, but he got injured. And the thing about his injury was the offense didn't really look that much different with Isaiah Likely. So I wonder if Andrews, obviously, he's going to be as good as he ever was. He's still at prime age. The injuries that Mark Andrews has had in his career, none of them have been kind of that soft tissue, hamstring, Julio Jones type stuff where you're like, oh, like he's just never going to be the same. But I wonder if we see a lot more 2 tight end stuff, a lot more of, maybe Andrews plays 70% of the snaps instead of 90% of them because Likely just needs to be on the field. So I agree with you that it is deeper. But it's definitely, to me, not near as good at the high end, Craig.
Right. So, Joe, do you agree with that sentiment? Do you feel like you saw McBride last year and Laporta last year and Ferguson and Kincaid? I mean, these are all names of players that are in the top 12. We haven't even, seen Brock Bowers play in the NFL as well. I don't know. Maybe my narrative is off here, Joe. I don't know. But it does seem to me that when young tight ends come into the NFL, and even have marginal success, isn't it fair to assume the next year that they would have a little bit more? If that's the case, then I think that I'm right. If not, then, obviously I'll be left on the curb at tight end.
Well, I think you're right in the sense that there's more talented tight end than we've seen in a long time. Now, does that always turn into productivity? That's a question we have to ask ourselves depending on where the landing spot is. Depending on where Brock Bowers ends up, he's already a top tight end for me in fantasy, period. Like, I'm ready to just jump on that ship right away. Laporta, we saw from game 1 against the Chiefs how he was going to be used. And if he was still floating around your fantasy league, you should have grabbed him as soon as you possibly could in week 1 waivers. It's funny, too. You're looking at these lists here, and you got the guys playing in the Super Bowl, Mahomes and Purdy as QB1s. You got the 2 tight ends, Kittle and Kelsey, still on this tight end 1 list. You see a lot of the talent in the Super Bowl. The fantasy talent does filter over into reality. Trey McBride, I think, is the guy that, again, I'm circling on this list because I think that the target volume you saw was enormous, and that might change if they do get a Harrison in the draft, perhaps. But you're going to have Hawkinson missing at least the first month of the season, maybe even more. Ferguson was a really interesting piece. Dak certainly looked for him in the red zone. That's a positive thing. But the guy to me that I think is the biggest conundrum and riddle is David Njoku, because we've waited years for somebody to unlock David Njoku, and it turned out to be Joe Flacco. And I don't think that's something we can bet on next year because he didn't do this with Deshaun Watson under center. And I don't know if he can or if Deshaun Watson's capable at this point. So that's the guy that I know everybody was very excited for the Njoku breakout. We've all been waiting for it, but can we count on it in 24? I think that is a very risky selection there.
Yeah. All right. So now from the tight end position, let's move over to the running back position in the NFL, and then we'll do wide receivers as well, gentlemen. So, look, this is always the dynamic every year where the game has changed so much that running backs are supremely hard to predict. And we even saw this past year, it was no different. I mean, great players taken in the first round, but bust as well. Bijan Robinson turned out to be a bust. Nick Chubb got hurt. It is the make or break part of fantasy football. So Christian McCaffrey is going to be the number one overall pick in every fantasy draft. And I don't know that we are able to say that a lot in February as we look toward August. I mean, it's a guarantee. Breece Hall had a fantastic year. We have him at 2, Bijan at 3, Kyron Williams at 4. And then Davis, certainly from there, things get interesting. Jahmyr Gibbs, who would have predicted he would be in the top 5. Jonathan Taylor potentially maybe playing his last year in Indianapolis. Who really knows? I know he's gotten paid, but you never really know how that's going to work out. Lots of variance, without a doubt. And you cannot sit here and say beyond Breece Hall, like honestly, beyond Breece Hall, can you guarantee that any of these running backs are worth taking in the first round?
Yeah, I mean, I think the line for me is Gibbs. I would have Gibbs ahead of Kyron. And maybe I'll end up with like 9 eggs on my face at the end of this, but like and we said this last week on the show, I've done this before with Phillip Lindsay, with Alfred Morris, just name a guy, Damian Williams, right? I've literally, Craig, I've been playing fantasy football my literal entire adult life, and I've been the guy who's chased the Kyron Williams, the guy who was not the guy who ended up just kind of receiving all the volume for a team because of circumstances outside of his control. Very rarely does that guy end up justifying his costs Kenyon Drake, how about Tony Pollard, by the way? Maybe a not horrible comparison there. So I think McCaffrey, Breece, Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs, these guys are, to me, that's a first-round running back, right? Those are guys who are going to be getting 60 to 70% of their team's work. Gibbs maybe won't get as much, but he's just going to be so efficient with the touches that he does get. And then immediately after those 4 guys, it's like, I'm clicking wide receivers. Like Jonathan Taylor or a wide receiver. Travis Etienne or a wide receiver. Barkley or a wide... Rachaad White, you're telling me I have to take Rachaad White as the 10th running back in fantasy? No chance am I taking Rachaad White as the 10th running back in fantasy. I mean, maybe that is where he deserves to be ranked, but I'm just not going to be the guy who is selecting him in drafts if these costs tend to stay the same. Probably the most interesting name of these top 10 running backs, given that we have so much time before we get to know what the Dolphins are going to look like in 2024, it's got to be Devon Achane, because Achane was so good when we saw him on the field. He missed games with injury not once, but twice. Also was injured at his time at Texas A&M. He weighs 180 pounds. He was a track star at Texas A&M. Now, Devon Achane does not play like a scat back. When you watch him play, he thinks he's Jonathan Taylor. The guy thinks he's Jerome Bettis. He's like inviting contact. He's leading with his shoulder. Like he wants to play like a real NFL running back. And if you guaranteed me 17 games of healthy, non-encumbered production from Achane, I might take him ahead of Gibbs, honestly, because I don't think Mostert or Jeff Wilson Jr. is going to be, on the team or receiving the same workload. Both of them are unrestricted free agents after the season. I mean, he I think is just the biggest question mark heading into fantasy right now.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Davis too. I'm going to take the egg on my face, so get an extra dozen for me. I also have Jahmyr Gibbs ahead of Kyron Williams. Just a little bit more faith in that offense coming back and being healthy and running the way it should. There's only 3 guys that are first-round talents at running back. It's CMC, it's Breece Hall, and it's Bijan Robinson. And in all fairness, for Bijan Robinson, he did finish as RB12 last year. So he did still finish as an RB1, just made it. It's not all his fault. I feel like I want to hug him like Robin Williams hugged Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting and just say over and over again, it's not your fault, because Arthur Smith completely misused him, did not get him the football enough. It was madness. Why you draft a guy in the top 10 at running back and not utilize him as much as you could have? I'll never know, but Arthur Smith now is another job. You look at this grouping, so many questions, not enough answers. This is not the 0 RB theory, but it's certainly the fade running back and get them at the value you think is good. And now look, I was wrong on Rachaad White last year. the volume is king theory proved true with Rachaad White. But to Davis's point, do I want to take him as that 10th running back overall? No, I don't. So HN is the guy that's very interesting. I think there's also going to be guys that are going to pop like the Zamir Whites of the world, depending on what Josh Jacobs has happen. I think you're going to see a lot of movement there. But it doesn't get much better as you go on. I mean, maybe taking shots on guys like Tajee Spears as you get to RB2, who probably has a clear path. Let's see where Derrick Henry ends up. If he ends up in a really good offense, maybe he gets a bunch of touchdowns and he makes up for the age that he's at right now. Maybe he just continues to defy gravity as Adrian Peterson did later in his career when people thought every time that he was just done every single time. So running back right now is extremely tenuous. And I think you're looking at potentially the age of Joe Mixon and James Conner catching up with them, and Derrick Henry even too. Same thing with Aaron Jones. I mean, you look continuing on, we can't repeat Raheem Mostert's season, but Zamir White's the guy that I'm circling because if indeed we see that trend continue as it did the end of last year and Jacobs is somewhere else, White would be a guy that's going to fly up draft boards.
Yeah, and let's hold that thought because I do want to touch on what to me looks like a graphic of the 2022 first round in fantasy football. They've all moved out. We'll hit on that next.
47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks playing one touchdown pass, right? He can't win MVP with one touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on him.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the all-star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today on SportsGrid, our Super Bowl edition of the show. We're taking a look at some early rankings for the upcoming 2024 fantasy season. Craig Mish, along with Joe Pisapia and Davis Maddock here until noon Eastern. As we continue our conversation, we're hitting on the running back position. And I made the comment, Joe, that this looks a lot like players we took in the first round of 2022. I mean, Derrick Henry was one of the first picks in the draft. Alvin Kamara was one of the top picks in the draft. Josh Jacobs was coming off an incredible season. Joe Mixon was close to the first round. And so I think the danger zone is right here, rank these rankings here, because the end of the line is coming for a few of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some of these post-hype guys like Ramondre Stevenson, Javonte Williams. And this is where you can kind of make or break your draft. A lot of these players are going to go, like third, fourth, fifth round?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And then when you even talk about Aaron Jones, who, always finishes at RB1 pretty much since he was the starter. And then this year had a great week 1 and then did nothing else because of injury the rest of the season until the last couple games and into the playoffs, which finished with a flourish. But there's an unknown situation too. So there is a great unknown, a lot of age in this grouping, a lot of tread on the tires, which typically is not good for the running back position. And Davis, I'm sure you can attest to that as well. When you're looking at these names here, they don't feel like great investments. I think it all depends on where the overall ADP of these guys ends up. And I think you're going to see that pushed pretty deep, because I think just the way your suggestion, Craig, alludes to, and the way I'm talking about it, and probably Davis too, is we'd rather be targeting some of the bigger tight ends. We'd rather be even looking at quarterbacks. You're seeing in single quarterback leagues, people going up to take quarterbacks earlier than ever before. And that's because those guys are winning you weeks. It's hard, Davis, to look at this group of running backs and find the guys that are winning you weeks. Would you agree?
I mean, I can't really find one looking at this list of guys. I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm like, okay, well, Ramondre, I mean, if Ramondre gets as many touches, okay, sure. But then you get into this next cohort of guys, and I'm like, well, I just saw the DeAndre Swift experience. Wasn't that great? Nick Chubb's knee. I mean, I think Nick Chubb is a huge favorite to be placed on the physically unable to perform list to start the season. Austin Eckler is not going to be a Charger. He is not under contract. They are not going to give him the money that, look, we can get into the running back contract value stuff, but they're not going to pay him. Raheem Mostert, 32 years old. What is that worth to that franchise? It's just as of right now, it's just a huge mess. And this list, whatever the 25 through 36 of running backs looks like when we are doing this in August, I mean, I would be surprised if 2 of these names are in the same spot, because we have free agency, we're going to have all these guys get drafted. Now, maybe the saving grace for guys like Brian Robinson or Jalen Warren or Zamir White is that this is honestly a historically weak running back class. There's not even that many guys that you're I can kind of squint and see it. There's this fella from the University of New Hampshire named Dylan Lobb who was at the Senior Bowl. Is he might be a third round pick. It's okay, if we're talking about a guy from the University of New Hampshire being the 4th best running back in a class, it's probably an indication that the running back class is not all that good. The number 1 running back in the class is Braylon Allen, who is a converted safety and is 19 years old coming out of Wisconsin. I'm telling you, it is a mess at running back. And you might be saying, well, Davis, why is it such a mess? And this is the first wrinkle we are seeing of NIL impacting the labor market in the NFL. Because if I am Travion Henderson, who went back to the Ohio State instead of going to the NFL, I can say, all right, well, I can stay at Ohio State where I can compete for a national championship. I can make the same amount of money or maybe more money than I would make if I was a 6th round pick for the Chargers or whatever. And I'm going to get the ball. And I get to be in college still, right? College is the best. Who doesn't want to be in college? I think about being in college all the time. It's a no-brainer. If you're going to be a 5th, 6th, or 7th round pick as a running back, it is a no-brainer to stay in college, take the NIL money, and I think that's going to be something very interesting that impacts the running back labor market the next couple of years.
Real quick, too, I just want to throw this in there, Craig, because Davis said it and it popped in my head. It's also the evolution, I think, of people seeing and young athletes seeing that the running back position is not getting paid at the NFL level anymore. So you're seeing some of the better athletes starting to pivot in terms of what position they're going to play. If you have the height to be a wide receiver, well, you're moving out there. If you have the ability to play corner and shut down people, you're going to go play there. Like you're not getting paid at the running back position in the NFL anymore. The guaranteed money's not there. The long term, you've seen it every year. These guys are holding out. They're not getting the money that maybe they deserve, but it's also the evolution of the game. But you're going to continue to see that too. I think some of the athletes are going to start to pivot in terms of what position they are desirable to play in college, and that's going to eventually impact the NFL as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how popular the position is and the players too. But, Joe, you're right. I mean, if that's the case, why attempt to do that in high school and in college if you can get paid doing something else? Okay, so let's take a look at our final group of rankings here. And, someone on this list is going to end up probably being first-round pick in fantasy in 2025. It always happens every year like this, but it's hard to predict who it is. So we have DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris. Davis mentioned Nick Chubb, Brian Robinson, Mostert. Not a lot of bite on what happened with him this past year. Eckler mentioned as a free agent. Davis, when you look at this here, certainly there's not a ton of sexy names as far as like young players, maybe on the up and up. But I would guess that there'll be somebody here that's going to just way outperform their position, whether it's somebody else on the team getting injured or just their own ability.
I mean, I think the best name is probably Zamir White. I think it was the name that Joe said a little bit earlier, which is like he was like a pretty good prospect. He was very good last year when filling in for Josh Jacobs. We'll see if Josh Jacobs is in fact a Raider. There's a lot of different directions that could go in this upcoming season. But what I do know is that the coaching staff there wants to do one thing, which is they want to hand the ball off. They want to try and run the ball 30 times a game if they can get away with it. He's got, I think, like a pretty built-in workload there in a way that a lot of these other guys do not. And I think that is going to end up serving him very well. I think he's going to end up, kind of shooting up draft boards a good bit.
Yeah, I'm just going to hedge this whole group and keep pushing, to be honest. Like, why not look for guys a little bit later, even the Zach Charbonnets of the world or Roshan Johnson, if the pathways start to clear for him? Like, why even do this? Just take shots on guys or wait for the waiver wire, because remember, the draft is not the end all. It's just the beginning. So lock in the talent you can get. And running back right now, once again, too many questions, not enough answers.
Fair enough. All right. So when we do drafts, of course, coming up later in the spring and in the summer, the wide receiver position is going to be one where we're going to see several first-round picks. I think you could pretty much guarantee 3, maybe 4 in upcoming drafts. So, look, Tyreek Hill had a fantastic season, got close to 2,000 yards, ended up not getting there, but missed a game. Justin Jefferson was the number 1 or number 2 overall pick in every fantasy draft last year. He missed a portion of the season. And Davis C.D. Lamb was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football. So he is going to end up being taken pretty high. Some other new names that you'll see there, Puka Nacua, clearly off last year. Garrett Wilson, the belief will be very high based on Aaron Rodgers being that. And I guess I am surprised here to see 2 San Francisco 49ers potentially taken as wide receiver 1s.
Yeah, this isn't going to be the way it shakes out. Right now we're very early. People are kind of just throwing up their hands. They're like, look, they're both really good. Come on. This is a pro Deebo Samuel show here on Fantasy Sports Today. We do not do the Brandon Ayuk propaganda. Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk have both been together in a game 51 times together in their career. There's been a lot of time where one or the other has been out. Deebo has smoked Brandon Ayuk in those games. I think he's averaging like 5.5 fantasy points more per game than Brandon Ayuk in those games. It's really not all that close. Now you could say Deebo will always miss like 2 games a year because he just like always gets a shoulder injury or whatever. It just kind of feels like that is the way that it works for him. But that is going to be the guy who I actually think we might even see Deebo end up rising. Very interesting to see DJ Moore this high. He did have a very strong season in 2023. But I think you could make a very good argument that DJ Moore is about to have even better quarterback play with like the 19th quarterback he's played with in his NFL career. If Caleb Williams does end up being, if Deebo does end up being, or if Caleb Williams ends up being DJ Moore's quarterback in 2024, which is what I project to happen. I think there are worlds where we could actually see DJ Moore end up going ahead of like Garrett Wilson if, in fact, Caleb Williams does end up being the quarterback for that team. And because make no mistake about it, we will get, Craig, there will be one report. Rodgers doesn't look right. He's 39 years old. The Achilles, it's flaring up. He's getting some inflammation. Maybe it'll just be because Rodgers is a drama queen and he wants the more attention. But we will get a negative report on Aaron Rodgers' health at one point this offseason. I absolutely guarantee it.
Our next grouping of players are what I would view as the drop-off players, the players that went higher the year before and now have fallen back. And, maybe outside of Nico Collins, who was just amazing and honestly could be taken higher, I think, than a lot of people who are above him. But Joe, you have Stephon Diggs, who's gone from a top 10 receiver now to 17. You have Cooper Kupp, who's got the biggest drop-off from one year to the next, has gone from a first-round pick all the way down to 24. Jalen Waddle, who was a hot name last year in the top 15, he is down to 20. Metcalf is down to 19. And so, look, you could get bounce backs from all of these players, but there aren't a ton of, I would call upsides listed here, where players that have now all of a sudden jumped in outside of maybe Tank Dell or Rashee Rice. That's not a lot. And so I just wonder if you would rather take your chances on a player who's fallen out of the top 12 or the few that have jumped into the top 24.
Well, this group in the wide receiver too, I think the bounce back clearly is Jalen Waddle. He was just not healthy all year. And I don't really know how much more Tyreek Hill has left in the tank. I mean, he's a guy who's talked about retiring soon and all that stuff. So we'll see how that pans out. But Waddle, I think, is really good. Rice was my favorite late draft pick last year because I talked about all the time. Somebody's going to catch the ball in Kansas City. And Rice was the guy who was the cheapest. So why not take a shot on him? Tank Dell, it's the size I think you worry about, but the guy is Houston Texans, Nico Collins, that you really want to pay attention to that offense. That's a guy that should be in this top 12, in my opinion. So I would move him there. Same with Michael Pittman. I think he's going to be cracking that wide receiver one conversation. And if you go back and look at those wide receiver ones, I think that's basically your first 8 picks of your first round, putting in McCaffrey, Robinson, and Hall probably. And I keep coming back to that same thing, which is Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to go anywhere from 6 to 8. Overall, what an incredible investment in the middle of drafts to take Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think Garrett Wilson will be a first-round pick and should be a first-round pick. So should Puka Nacua. A.J. Brown, I think, is that talent. You can't ignore him. Nico's a guy that at the turn I'd be really interested to take there at the turn. I would be very reticent to let him get past me at any turn. So I think the wide receiver 2 grouping, some age there, just like in those RB2s that I'm going to stay away from. Instead, I'm going to look for the Nikos. I'm going to look for the Michael Pittmans. I think those are the guys in Rashee Rice to really pay attention. It's not that deep sometimes, boys and girls. Take the guys who have better quarterback play, and more often than not, things are going to work your way.
Yeah, and we still have plenty more to come here, by the way, because, again, we still have the wide receiver 3s and the wide receiver 4s to examine. So coming up after the break, we will get to that, as well as a reset at the top of the hour as we continue on here on this edition of Fantasy Sports Today. But don't forget, we have programming all day long leading up to and during the Super Bowl in Las Vegas. We had a ton of coverage all week long, by the way. Fantastic job by everybody who went out there to Las Vegas. And we're still going to go right through midnight here on the show today and on all of our shows. So let's take a quick timeout. Joe and Davis will recap the wide receiver 3 position. I'll be back with you at the top of the hour. We'll go through wide receiver 4s and then get back to our Super Bowl coverage, the game that starts at 6:40 Eastern. We'll be back with more FST. Don't go away.
Great.
47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
The Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks playing 1 touchdown pass, right? You can't win MVP with 1 touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs. but I bet on him.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, seventh in assists, and eighth in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back, everybody, to the supersized edition of Fantasy Sports Today on Super Bowl Sunday. Joe Pisapia, Davis Maddock here talking about my favorite Super Bowl bets. And if I'm on the Chiefs and I like them on the money line, the question is, well, that's plus 110. So should I look for something even better in terms of my return on investment? And that return is Patrick Mahomes at MVP at plus 135. Typically, this is a quarterback award. We know that. Am I a little afraid about the Swifties influencing that other bet if Travis Kelce comes in and has a great game? Yes, I am. I am worried about that, as I am worried about the teenage daughters in my house anyway. But still, to me, this is the way to really capitalize. If you are concerned at all about the Kansas City Chiefs coming out in victory, then you've chosen the wrong show and the wrong duo to talk about it with. Now, the 49ers certainly earned their spot. They deserve to be there. But Davis, you and I are very much on this side, but I keep saying if you like the Chiefs to win, maybe the better bet is just to go right to Mahomes at MVP at the plus 135 as opposed to the plus 110 on the money line. What do you think of my best bet here?
Well, I don't disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. The 2019 season, so the 2020 Super Bowl, 49ers, Kansas City Chiefs, Damian Williams had the game of his life. 150 yards, 2 touchdowns. You also, we were talking about how we don't remember specific plays. I remember specific plays. It's 2nd and 8. The Chiefs had the ball, 2 minutes and 10 seconds left. Damian Williams breaks off to the left side, runs for about 45 yards, and then takes a knee. Smartly takes a knee to ensure that the Chiefs win the game. They run the clock out, game over. Had he scored, maybe they would have given him MVP. Maybe they would not have. But he didn't win MVP. Mahomes did in a good game, but Damian Williams was the MVP of that game. They didn't give it to him. Why did they not give it to him, Joe? Because the quarterback always gets it. If the quarterback has a decent game and the team wins, he gets it.
Typically, that is the case, so we shall see how it all plays out. Maybe it's Brock Purdy as MVP. Interesting lines there, too. You're getting him and McCaffrey kind of close to each other, which tells you, again, if the San Francisco 49ers win, I think there's a better chance of McCaffrey getting that award than Brock Purdy. Hot take, maybe. We'll see what Craig Mish and everybody else thinks about it. We return. Don't go anywhere. FST Hour 4 starts right now.